Hi, my name's Michael, and this is the second in a series of videos I'll be making called Philosophical Investigations. Not a very original title, but nonetheless kind of covers what we're trying to do here. In my first video I talked about the nature of philosophy, and I suggested that the best way to understand what philosophy actually is to see it as what we do when we really don't know how to proceed. And I suggested that this really impacts how philosophy is seen. First of all, it's difficult to say exactly what philosophy is, what its methods are, because you can imagine an engineer being called out to fix something. Sometimes they might know exactly what they're being called to fix. They might know what's wrong with it, and they might be able to just pack a carefully selected set of tools, 4 or 5 spare parts, turn up and fix the thing. But at other times they may not know what's wrong. Maybe there are plenty of different places that something could be wrong. There's no fixed toolkit that's going to work. They're going to have to bring a variety of tools, many of which they might never use, some of which they might use a lot, and they might have to bring a range of spares or be able to order parts from all sorts of places. And I would suggest that philosophy is like that, right? We don't know what tools we're going to need. We might have some idea of what the problem is that we're trying to address, but until we actually start getting to grips with it, we don't know necessarily how to go about it. And in fact, there may be no established tools for addressing the problem that we end up realizing we're confronting. We may have to develop new techniques, new tools. Other disciplines have to do this from time to time, but this is fundamental to philosophy. Philosophy is really what we do when we don't know how to proceed. I suggested that this is what gives the illusion that philosophy never accomplishes anything. I suggested that, well, once we work out how to deal with a particular problem, a particular issue, it ceases to be philosophy anymore. It becomes a discipline in its own right, one in which we have some idea how to proceed, and then people go away and get on with it. But so many things trace back to philosophy and philosophical reflections and attempts to get to grips with something very problematic. So what philosophy gets left with is all the things that we have never really managed to adequately explain, deal with, problems we've been unable to successfully resolve. Nowhere, I think, is this more true than in the case of the concept of the good, which is, of course, at the heart of moral philosophy. We have been trying since the time of Socrates, or Plato. Arguably Socrates may not have existed, but Plato certainly did, and we have the Platonic dialogues. And one of the main subjects that gets explored in those is the concept of the good. And we're still trying to get to grips with it now. Now, I spoke about why I became engaged with philosophy, and I suggested that one of the key issues of that drew me to philosophy was trying to understand how to live the good life, right? How to find the good as a kind of guiding light to help me make the decisions that would sort out some real difficulties in my own personal life. And I think that's important, not just for me. I think that as a society and a culture, we have enormous difficulties about knowing what the good is. In many respects, we seem to be losing any sense of the good. Amongst many moral philosophers now, particularly, um, well, there's sort of very much, at least in British academic circles, there are kind of two quite different, I mean, there are probably more, but you could divide a lot up into two quite distinct traditions. On the one hand, there are philosophy departments like the ones that I attended at UCL, King's, and LSE, and various other colleges of the University of London, really, primarily. And that's sometimes called analytical or Anglo-American philosophy, very much concerned with kind of the philosophy of language, philosophy of mathematics and science. And then there's another form, people talk about continental philosophy, following sort of people like, I don't know, Heidegger, Husserl, others, Foucault, which in a British context you tend to find more actually in sociology departments and in some of the arts, but not so much in philosophy departments, although some philosophy departments are much more continental than the ones that I attended in their sort of character. But one of the things that's happened with continental philosophy is that it's merged very much into kind of sociology, become very deeply entwined, sociology and also with activism. Sociology and activism have started to kind of coalesce in a lot of places, which again are a blending of philosophy and psychology that we find within the continental tradition. To the point that I think to many people have abandoned really what I would think of as philosophical engagement with the problem of the good. They have essentially accepted that there is really no grand moral principle that you could understand, that different cultures have different value systems, and that all you can really do is study the way that different cultures develop their value systems, and that a value system is always kind of relative to the culture that developed it. It is not appropriate, a lot of them would argue, to judge another culture or the behaviour of people within that other culture by the standards of your own culture or a different culture, because there is no grand scheme. You know, values emerge as cultural artifacts and are completely relative to the culture. Now, I think that there's something to be said for this, right? So it's quite difficult to kind of structure our thought, our discussion here, without going off on the many different tangents. But the project of giving a grand account of the good is one that we've been engaging in for several thousand years now, and we've never managed to do it. It's interesting to go back and look at the beginning. Perhaps I doubt that Plato's the first, but Socrates in the Platonic dialogues with his investigations of the good is certainly a very important early stage in the development of moral philosophy, perhaps its birth point. And what Socrates does in the dialogues is quite relevant today and interesting. Essentially, what he does, with a variety of concepts, but one of the key ones is the concept of the good and related concepts like justice. Right? He will ask his protagonist what they think that the good is. Right? What defines something as morally good, as the good? What's their account of the good? And they will generally produce some sort of explanation. The good is what's pleasing to the gods. The good is what makes us happy. The various different attempts to give an account of the good. And what Socrates will then proceed to do is to present them with various scenarios in which he asks them to, on the one hand, make a judgment themselves. Right? This is their own judgment. He doesn't tell them what it is. He asks them to make a judgment about what is and what is not good, the good in that situation, and to apply this principle that they've come up with, right, and to see whether they tally. And in every instance, he is sooner or later able to come up with some scenario in which they have a very clear, shall we say, intuition, or they can make a clear judgment about what is good and what is bad in that particular context. And their principle, whatever principle they've come up with, violates it or proves inadequate in some way. And Socrates does this over and over again. And this is all that he does. Right? He never offers any account of the good, to replace theirs, or that he claims is superior to theirs. Now, at times, the actual way that Socrates appears, his character in different Platonic dialogues, does vary. Socrates in the Theaetetus is very, very different to Socrates in the Republic. But one way of reading what Socrates is doing is that he is, in a sense, a skeptic. But it's a very particular kind of form of skepticism, in my view, because what I think Socrates is trying to get us to do is to recognize that we have an understanding of the good. That this is a kind of pre-rational concept, the understanding, that it's, in a way, it's like a perception. So our perceptual apparatus builds up a representation of the world. It lets us know what our environment is like, right? This is something we'll talk about in other videos. The way that I resolve some of the problems with this is that we don't see a representation of the world. Right? The way that we do see the world is by building up a perceptual representation of it. Right? So the building of a perceptual representation is the seeing. Right? And this resolves a lot of the conflict over perception. Right? So I don't want to claim that we see a representation, but in our cognition we build up a cognitive representation of the world that is linguistic. I mean, maybe it's not pre-linguistic. Maybe it's a representation in some kind of mental language, right? But it's not our everyday language, the language in which we conduct rational debates and arguments. And it seems that in some sort of similar way, we can form an understanding or make a judgment about right and wrong in a particular situation without having any rational means of making that judgment, because we don't understand on what basis we're making the judgment, which we're able to do it. It's something that is kind of given to us, right? Maybe coming from our unconscious mind. Where it comes from is open to debate, right? But what Socrates is trying to get us to recognize, I think, is that we have this capability, and that it isn't coming from within our rational discourse. Rather, it's underlying it and coming from somewhere else. Now, it's something I don't really want to get too drawn into. I'm very prone to, because this subject of where this comes from, what's going on here, is one that I find extremely fascinating. I'd say that Socrates lends himself to a kind of moral intuitionism, right? That we have an intuition into what is the right and the wrong in a particular situation. Now, I think myself, I believe that what Socrates is trying to do is to get us to acknowledge our dependence on a sort of layer that would in modern terms be very much related to the unconscious mind, but much more a kind of Jungian unconscious than a Freudian unconscious, right? An unconscious that is capable of furnishing us with a perceptual representation of the world and with a conceptual understanding of the world, right? That underpins our linguistic discussions and ideas about the world. And there's a huge amount of evidence supporting this in different ways. I mean, for example, when you look at decision making, one thing that psychologists have observed about decision making in things like job interviews is that very often the decision has been made before the person making the decision is even aware that they've made the decision. And that what then follows in terms of their rationalization is not so much making the decision, but finding some justification to explain the decision that they've already made. And Socrates is trying to make us understand that something very much like that is what's going on in many of our core concepts. That our rationalizations are not actually the driving, they're not in the driving seat. Our attempts to explain the good, our concepts in this sense of the kind of rational constructs we make to try and give an account of the good are not actually what drive our judgments about the good. They're not what control our behavior, since presumably whatever we see as the good we try to pursue as a goal. We'll get to that in a bit, because that's not that's maybe one of the key things about morality, is that in pre-moral judgments about the good, they're always relative. They're relative to an interest. They're relative to a context. Quite often it's implicit rather than spelt out. But to say that something's good, it's always in a pre-moral sense, is almost always relative to a context or an interest, and in a pre-moral sort of language, to say that something is good, if I was picking a screwdriver, right, to tighten a screw, and I said to you, is that a good screwdriver? And you said, no, that's not a good one, that's a much better one, right? If I believed that you knew what you were talking about, right, I would not take the worst screwdriver. In moral discourse, it seems, and Plato argues that the same thing really applies in moral philosophy, that if somebody understands what the good is in a context, they would never choose the bad over the good. Well, in a pre-moral sense, you would never choose the bad over the good, right? Because the whole point about something being good is that it is fit for that purpose. But in moral discourse, it does seem that people can extol something as being good and yet behave in a completely different way, and that kind of sets it apart. So I think that Socrates is trying to make us understand that there is something mysterious going on. Right? That our understanding is partial. That our rational mind is not the measure of all things. That it does not control all things, and that there is something very mysterious going on, and that it's absolutely vital important that we recognise and acknowledge it, our dependence on some almost unknowable, mysterious layer of being, and that this isn't, I mean, if any, in a way Socrates is not quite, this is very much related to sort of modern theological concepts of God as being a sort of mysterious ground of existence, the sort of the fundamental reality from which everything springs, but which we can never, is beyond our understanding, beyond our comprehension, and that we should not try and define and compartmentalize, because that's a form of idolatry. That's imposing ideas on something that is beyond our comprehension, right? It's kind of very similar. I think there's a relationship between them, but there's an important difference, because in Socrates, this mysterious ground is in us. We have this capacity to make these judgments that we can't account for. And so I think Socrates is about building a relationship with that. Plato's clearly related to Socrates, but Plato is interested in kind of not just acknowledging this mysterious realm, but in starting to try and map it out. So he introduces his concept of the forms, where he starts to say, well, from the fact that I can make judgments about the good, I can conclude something about this mysterious thing I'm having so much trouble giving an account of, and it must be a deeper level of mind in which the form or the fundamental concept of the good exists. and that somehow this must be more real than the world in which I'm applying these judgments, because what I'm seeing is a kind of a reflection or a projection out into the world of core this core reality of forms. But Socrates isn't doing this. Socrates never tries to fill this in. In fact, when he gives some sort of indication of it, because he does talk about how he goes to work in the introduction to some of the dialogues, and in one of them he says, well, this is what I do. I sit round in a marketplace or wherever it is, and I wait, and every now and then the gods point somebody out to me and set me to work. So here, this mysterious ground, in much the same way that you can have an intuition about what is good, what is the bad in a particular scenario, so he sees somebody, and in much the same way that you can recognize the good, he recognizes them as somebody he should go to work on. Now, Socrates' theory is what Socrates is doing. I think Socrates is doing something important. I think he's the sort of father of what I would call positive skepticism. So positive skepticism. So I think there are two forms of skepticism. There is negative skepticism, and most philosophical skepticism, at least since Descartes, the dominant form of skepticism that's used in philosophy is what I would call negative skepticism. So it starts with Descartes in his first meditation. So Descartes says, I want true and certain knowledge. I want to really get down to the bedrock of knowledge. I want to test my knowledge and my ideas, and the best way I can think of to test them is to develop the strongest possible skeptical arguments that I can develop and apply them to my knowledge as a kind of test to sieve out the false ideas, and get down to the incontrovertible bedrock that will let me build my knowledge, rebuild my knowledge on a secure, incontestable foundation. He's not interested in what the skeptical arguments might say to him are unknowable, in how they might undermine his certainty. Right? He's seeking certainty. Right? And skepticism is just a device, a cutting tool, a sieve to sieve away the uncertainty. Right? So that's negative, what I would think of as negative skepticism. Positive skepticism is quite different. Positive skepticism sees there as being benefits in embracing uncertainty. It is very much like Jung and his, I think before Jung, really, William Blake. I think William Blake is a wonderful example of positive skepticism. When he asks us, who knows what world of joy is contained in a flying bird? His whole concept of the revolt of reason, which very much, relates to Jung's concept of the sort of fourfold nature man and the divisions and the way that rationality can turn against the intuition, the emotions, and even the perceptions, and try and appoint itself as the supreme judge of all that is. Right? This is very much William Blake's Revolt of Reason. And Blake isn't when he says who knows what world of joy is contained in a flying bird, he's not asking us to embrace solipsism, right, which is the way that most philosophers understand what would happen if the skeptic was to succeed, right, in undermining claims to knowledge completely. We would end up with, well, we know nothing except residing in appearances. Right? Oh, I love this one. Okay. So, A.J. Ayer. Bought me a few pints, did A.J. Ayer. Well, he was dead by then, but I won the A.J. Ayer Prize for philosophy in my UCL in my first year. And much to the annoyance of a number of the professors and staff. But anyway, I've always had a funny impact on people. Some people think I'm pretty hot stuff, but an awful lot of people think, why the hell would they think that about him? He's just weird. Anyway, A.J. Ayer wrote a book, Language, Truth and Logic. I really enjoyed reading it, and it is in a sense, it's an exposition of the standard philosophical understanding of skepticism, in which he actually embraces it. So what he suggests is that all we can know about the world is appearances, right? The world is a construction out of sense contents, is the way that he puts it. And he suggests that the only language that's meaningful is language that can be translated into statements about this world constructed out of sense contents. If it can't, so if you were to try and talk about Kant's noumenal, the thing in itself, the thing unperceived, right? The thing not as it seems to an outward observer, but as it seems in and for itself, right? To Ayer, that's meaningless. And as I read Language, Truth and Logic, I believed I agreed with so much of what he was saying. But what was going on for me was something that Ayer never intended. Because as all sorts of ideas, as I thought about Ayer's argument and all sorts of ideas I might have about the underlying reality in the world, right, as they got kind of wiped away, and you think, well, I mean, I might feel like I kind of know that, I have this concept, and I might think, but actually when I stop and think about it, I have no real evidence for it, especially if I start thinking in terms of what I can actually see, what other people can see, what can be confirmed, all sorts of concepts from Ayer's point of view, from the point of view of a logical positive, are just meaningless. They seem meaningful until you really start to examine them, and it turns out that they're complete and utter nonsense. Now, for Ayer, is a bit like Descartes, right? Except that Descartes thinks he can rebuild a vast structure of knowledge. For Ayer, you get right down to the hard empirical sciences, and that's everything. That's all that you can. That's actually meaningful. Everything else is just nonsense. But for me, it was like wiping the dust away from a window. These concepts that have been obscuring the acknowledgement that, I suppose, it's night out there and there is a vast deep that I've had the curtains drawn on, you know. I've been writing in the dust on the window, but this has wiped it away. It wasn't really dark. It was like there was a light, you know. It's like opening out and seeing a vast vista. Fundamentally different to what Aya was aiming at. And that to me is positive skepticism. And I'll make a video, I'll talk about this in other terms, how you can actually see the result of skepticism not as being solipsism, but as being a kind of liberation. That residing in appearances is not about a sort of Aya's a positivist construction into horrible empiricism. It's about being open to the possibility that that flying bird does live in a world of joy that is just radically different to the one that you've been living in, and the possibility even of transforming your own world by changing, by letting go of the way that you have been seeing the world, about the way that the ideas that you've had about the world, and embracing new and different ideas and opening up new possibilities. Skepticism to me is something that is liberating, and the denial of skepticism very much in the way that Jung talked about the unconscious and the denial of the unconscious, and explored how he saw that operating in, for example, the emergence of Nazi Germany, you know, that by denying and repressing the unconscious, of adopting a very rationalist sort of approach, that Germany had forced its unconscious down, and now it was emerging as the old gods re-emerged as the gods of the fascist movement, and swept away the rationalism of pre-Nazi Germany and replaced it with a sort of neo-pagan dream. But does that kind of help, right? I mean, I think this is important stuff. I think this is very, very interesting, and it's something I've gone. But it does that mean that we can never really understand what the good is? That it's just something that's given to us? Is moral intuitionism the only solution to the problem of what is the good? Well, don't really know. It's just it's just an intuition. Some people have good ones, some people don't have it so much. The people who don't have it so much, you know, the men of brass, the men of lead, the men of iron, should listen to the men of gold, who have this intuition in a very advanced way, and that's all there is to it. Well, I don't think it helps. I don't think that is much as I think that skepticism and embracing the concept of the intuition, of you know, being furnished with things by the unconscious, having sources of knowledge other than rational debate, including and rational argument, including, perceptual, including intuition, and including a kind of emotional intelligence. That these are important things, and that we should understand that rationality is not the measure of everything, and needs to engage with these. But I don't think we should simply flip everything on its head and say, well, if rationality isn't the measure of everything, well, maybe intuition is. Can intuitions be right? Can intuitions be wrong? If I look back over my own life, I find that my intuitions have, in many respects, been good. I mean, for example, if ever I have felt that there was something off about somebody I've met, that they were not somebody to be trusted, that their intentions were not what they might appear to be, I have only ever regretted going against such an intuition. But my understanding of the good, my recognition of the good has changed. And it's not necessarily that it's got clearer as I've gained experience and grown. Sometimes it has actually changed. Sometimes things that I have in the past thought were okay, I have subsequently decided were not. And sometimes there are things that I have felt very strongly and passionately were wrong that I have in later life come to accept. I mean, a good example would be, predation by human beings and by other animals. Hunting, killing for food, or, not so much for sport, but for food. That was something that what I felt would be an intuition was that it was something awful. My intuition, my immediate reaction to killing is that it's a terrible thing. I still think, all in all, it's all things being equal, then killing is, I would judge killing to be a bad thing, but all things are not equal. Actions have consequences. And distasteful and unpleasant as killing might be, there are times when the consequences of not killing would be enormously worse than the consequences of killing. I mean, the obvious example of it is when you have a predator that keeps the numbers of a species in check. And whilst it might seem that if you removed the predator from the scenario, the prey species would benefit enormously. Now they don't have to go in fear of being eaten. You then discover that the whole balance of the ecosystem becomes pushed out of kilter, and that the prey species, far from thriving, has a sudden burst of numbers before completely depleting the resources that they're dependent on and being wiped out by mass starvation. For example, my intuitions about killing really didn't give any indication of that kind of thing. That's something that I've come to understand with age, education, and experience. So this is not just a sharper intuition. It's realizing that some of my past judgments were flawed and very much incomplete. So I don't think that intuitionism, despite everything I've said about the virtues of positive skepticism, which I think is a very important thing, simply accepting the Socratic conclusion, I know what the good is, but I don't know how because it comes from some mysterious depth of my psyche, isn't adequate. It won't do it. It won't do. So, how do we proceed? I'm certainly not the only one to conclude that it won't do, right? I mean, if this was a good solution, if moral intuitionism was a good solution to the dilemmas, the problems that we face being in the world and having to make decisions about how to act, what goals to pursue. If this was adequate, moral philosophy would have ended years ago, because Socrates has already pointed the way to this, and people have embraced the idea. There are some people who have embraced moral intuitionism and argued that this is how we should accept this, and this is how we should deal with it. And it just hasn't worked. I mean, in the sense that it hasn't resolved the difficulties, and it doesn't do it for me. I value my moral intuitions, but I don't think that they're adequate on their own. So how can we proceed? Is there something more we can do to understand what's going on with morality? Now, I think that there is, because what Socrates is doing is he's taking somebody who has a sort of system of ideas and beliefs about morality, who has formed an ability to make moral judgments. However they've formed it, we don't know, right? But they've got this at a particular state, and he's asking them to use this facility to make judgments in a particular situation, right? And he's contrasting them to their ideas about the basis on which they're making these judgments, and showing them that whatever their rational idea, their rationalization of their moral judgments might be, in fact their moral judgments are quite distinct from them, right? But maybe we could get, if we take this starting point, this Socratic starting point, and say, well, clearly I've developed something, right, that goes on. I can make these judgments, but the way I think I'm making them, the basis on which I think I'm making them, seems to be something else. I need to rethink how I'm making these judgments. Well, maybe one way of going about this would be to try and retrace the steps, see where this ability to make these judgments came from, where it comes from, how it developed. Maybe that will give me a better understanding of how we do it. And a lot of work has been done on this. And a very key period has been sort of, I think, identified in a lot of this work, which is a transition that occurred in ancient Greece. At a certain point in ancient Greece, when they used the language of the good, the bad, right, they don't seem to use it in a moral sense. They just use it in a very non-moral sense. What's a non-moral sense? So it's just the everyday use of good, where we don't think we're making some sort of absolute judgment of worth about something, but in our everyday use of the word, well, it's very difficult to give a characterization of it because it operates in very different ways in different contexts. But there is something that I think is very common about our use of the language of the good, our non-moral use of it, which is that it is always conditional. It's always relative to a context or an interest. If I ask you, is that food good, right? I may not start out by laying out some sort of context. Often what I'm asking is just clear from the situation, right? Is that food good? So we're in a restaurant, somebody's ordered it, and I go, is that good? Right? The context lets us know what I'm asking, right? Which is generally, right? Some more background information might change this slightly, but generally that would be, is it well cooked? Is it tasty? Are you enjoying eating it? Now, in other contexts, I might be asking slightly more. I might be, for example, it might be that in a particular context, the nutritional value of that food is more important than the flavour or the texture. Right? Sometimes we're uncertain. So if I said to you, is that food good? And you knew that I was interested in nutrition and stuff, you might say, well, what do you mean? It tastes pretty good, but it's got an awful lot of sugar in it. What are you asking? Now, there are many different things you could ask, is that good, about, right? And many different contexts in which you could ask the question. And it would be impossible to give an account, a concept of the good that encompasses all the different judgments that you might make. But when it comes to non-moral language, we don't bother doing that because we understand that what unites all these different situations is that we're asking about a very simple relationship, which is at heart simply that A is fit for purpose B. interest be, where A could be anything from a behaviour, it could even be an idea, it could be a sensation, and the purpose could be a vast range of possible contexts and purposes. And you don't have to know how you might make those judgments in all different situations in order to understand the concept of the good. You simply have to understand what kind of relationship it is. And that this type of relationship can be quite different in different scenarios. Now, in relation to what the historians of philosophy and culture and of ancient Greece have observed, is that initially when you were talking about, say, a king or an aristocrat, right, a dominant character in their society, a ruler, they had a kind of aristocratic class, landed class, that were socio-economically dominant. And if you were to ask of one of them, is he good? Is he a good king? Is he a good leader? It would be this non-moral kind of judgment that being looked at. A good king would simply be a king who is successful in governing. The idea that you could have a good king who was deposed in a coup or defeated by an adversary would, in this use of language, be absurd, right? Because, you know, if you just ask in generally if he's a good king, right, you're asking if he's successful, if he has great ability at ruling and governing and protecting his lands. And if he's defeated and his lands are taken from him, either by an outside enemy or by a coup within, well, clearly he was not a good ruler. Now, with this kind of language, you could still get a sense of he was not a good king, right? But he was, or at least he wasn't a good king in terms of his ability to protect his realm, but he was good at managing the farms in his realm, for example. He was good at managing agriculture. That would be possible. But we're still kind of very much contextual. And what the historians think happened was that as this aristocratic class lost their socio-economic dominance and new classes began to emerge as the city-states became more and more important and an sort of, an urban elite began to develop, these people wanted to hang on to their claim to some kind of deserving socio-economic dominance. And one of the mechanisms that they used to do that was by appropriating the language of goodness, right? My father was a good king. I inherit from him this quality of being good. But because they're losing their socio-economic influence, right, it's being challenged, they can no longer claim the justification in direct terms, in contextual terms, if you like, in terms of their success. It now has to become something more kind of abstract. The fact that my father was a good king made him deserve to be king. And I have inherited that in the way that, socioeconomic positions get inherited. I must therefore have inherited the same kind of goodness that gives me the desert to do this. But now it's not, it's abstracted. It's no longer grounded in the fact that they are actually successfully ruling. They're actually losing their influence. They're losing their position. And so you begin to get a new concept emerging of the good that is being used as a device to try and influence other people, and as a psychological device to try and bolster their own sense of worth. And this is now quite different. This is becoming different from the earlier use. Because it's no longer relative in a way. They are in a sense trying to claim an absolute goodness, a goodness that persists, even when the context, the circumstances that would have made you judge that their forefathers were good kings or, good landowners, right, have gone. And this is a change in the language. And I think this idea that a judgment about the good is independent of context is one of the things, one of the characteristics of moral discourse. And it changes things, right? Because once you're trying to use language in this way, once you're trying to talk about some sort of abstract, absolute concept of the good, the formal way of justifying claims about the good. If I ask you if that's a good screwdriver and you say yes, and I say, well, you know what, I think you're wrong, how do we then debate about it? Well, they say, well, okay, well, what are you trying to do with it? And I might say, well, actually, I'm trying to get the lid off this tin, not unscrew that, and what you're giving me is a Phillips screwdriver, and that's not really very good for getting under the lip of a tin. A flathead one would be good, right? It's not by reference to some profound abstracted concept of the good, right? It's by looking at the purpose that I'm trying to put it for and seeing if your judgment that would be good for that, right, actually holds up when I understand the nature of the thing and what I'm trying to do with it, or what I'm trying to use it for, or the context in which it's going to operate. It's not necessarily to do something with it. But now that kind of thing doesn't work. You've got to break it down. They've got to abandon that because they are losing their socio-economic position. And they're now trying to switch it round. They're not good because they're good at socio-economic dominance, and that's the context in which this judgment is being made. Now they're trying to say, I deserve to be successful. You should yield to me in socio-economic contexts because I'm good. And it's a complete reversal. And now it's this concept of good that has to justify what's being demanded. Right? It's no longer that what's good in this context is what will deliver what's wanted. It's now what's wanted should be delivered because I have this quality of this, in this particular case, as this is a changing socioeconomic class, because of my inheritance, because of my innate worth as a member of this class. So what is that concept of the good? And we've never ever managed to pin it down. think that this points to another kind of key component of moral discourse, of this emergent moral discourse, which is that there's conflict here. There's a conflict of interests. Now, my first attempt at trying to understand how moral discourse differed from ordinary discourse was based around the observation that most moral language is a site of contention. There is conflict over it. Where there's no conflict, right, we don't tend to think of the language or judgments as being moral judgments. So, for example, hitting yourself with a hammer, right? It's a bad thing to do, right? We know it's a bad thing to do. It hurts, right? But nobody wants to hit themselves with a hammer, apart from a few very disturbed individuals. But most of us would, shy away from hitting ourselves with a hammer. There's no conflict over this. There's no debate about it. There's no argument about it. There's no tension over it. It's just bad. You don't want to do it, right? This is very much how Plato kind of understood the good, right? And perhaps Socrates as well, with this moral intuition that, or if we understand Socrates in terms of moral intuition, right, that to see something as good would be to want it, right? If you recognise that something's good, you will choose it. You would never knowingly choose the bad. Right? This is what it's very much what Plato thinks, that people who do bad things do it because they just fail to recognise what they are. If you knew it was the good, you would do it. And that makes sense with the pre-moral use of language, because to recognise something as good is to recognise that it would be the right thing to use or to do in this context. And if you claimed to think that that was good, but you actually did something else or used something else, that would be very clear evidence that actually you hadn't made that judgment at all. In fact, you thought the other one was good. I mean, obviously there's things like availability. Perhaps, that would be the good saw to use in this situation, but I'm going to have to use this inferior saw because it's the only one I've got. But this characterization of moral good, right, that Plato, it doesn't seem to accord with how people actually behave. Because people frequently do things that they recognize as wrong, as not being good. And I thought, and they can have, this isn't just sort of that they lie to people about things, they can have intense internal trauma about it. So this is Freud's superego and id, and the meeting point between their consciousness as basically occupying a battleground between the superego and its judgments about right and wrong, and the id and its childish appetites, and the need to try and balance them out. The impossible task the ego in Freud faces of standing between these two implacable foes. This does seem to actually characterize something about moral discourse. So my first thought was that what was going on is that I observed that there are certain kinds of actions, and stealing I think is a very good example, there are certain kinds of actions that most of us recognise we don't want other people to do to us. And we recognise that it's not in our interest to have society, have this as a widespread behaviour in society, right? Because if there's too much stealing, well, what's the point in a farmer working all year, planting and tending crops, if they're just going to be stolen at the end of the year? You know, why would bakers bake bread if it's going to be taken from them with no recompense? Stealing, widespread stealing, is just would be an incredible obstacle to social and economic development, and it would make all of our lives significantly worse. So we all have quite a strong interest in discouraging stealing. We have an interest in maintaining a public discourse in which we affirm that stealing is wrong and that you should not do it. And yet at the same time, we can't help but recognise that there are situations in which we have an individual interest in stealing, especially if we could do it undetected and get away with it. I'm not saying that that means that we all do it. You know, most of us, I think, reject even considering stealing. I had a friend who became a heroin addict, and he funded his habit. One of the ways he funded getting heroin was by stealing things, particularly bicycles, but anything that wasn't nailed down, really, like a lot of junkies. Talking to me about it, he said that he had changed, he had developed what he described as a thief's eye, that when he was walking around, he would just see unchained bicycles. They would, it would be there with a big sign on it saying, "Steal me." If he was in a shop, he'd be, he would be acutely aware when he was out of sight of store detectives and cameras, and the temptation to put a jar of coffee or a bottle of whiskey or something in his bag would be overwhelming. He had a thief's eye. He saw them all the time. Well, that isn't my experience of being out and about. And I think it isn't most people's experience of being out and about, because most of us kind of understand that if we started thinking about stealing, we might well get away with it. Most of us find ourselves every now and then in a situation where it would not be difficult to shove a jar of coffee in our bag out of sight and walk out of the shop with it. Quite a lot of us give way to that temptation. But a lot of us recognise that it's just too easy, that if we started doing it, it would become a habit, and sooner or later we would get caught, and there would be consequences, and they're not worth it. They just wouldn't be worth it, so we don't do it. But even if we don't do it, and even if we don't have a thief's eye, so we're not being tempted all the time because we're really attuned to these opportunities, we know they're there. There is a tension between what we say that this is bad, this is wrong, we shouldn't do it. But we can't help but know that there are times when we would actually benefit from doing it, at least in the short term. And some of these things are far more tempting than just putting a bag of coffee in your bag, They can be large sums of money, So if you're a drug dealer, I mean, this is a funny thing, right? I mean, the drugs industry is a major global industry, right? And you might think that an industry that is as wealthy and powerful as the drugs industry, the illicit drugs industry, right, would have no trouble getting itself legalized. Well, it probably wouldn't. But ironically, in his book, A Diary of a Drug Fiend, rather famous junkie and appalling character, Aleister Crowley, wrote about the period when a lot of the drug laws were first introduced. And he spoke about how, I think it was a French bishop, it was a bishop involved in pressing to have opiates criminalised, bought for himself a rather large opium processing plant shortly before succeeding in getting it criminalised. The fact is that the drugs industry benefits enormously from being a criminal endeavour. It evades huge amounts of taxation. It is able to sell its wares in the locations where it operates with a freedom that it wouldn't have if it was subject to legal controls and constraints. Make no mistake, the money from the drugs industry, one of the things that the recent Russia report highlighted was that there was an enormous level of laundering of illegal money from various, amongst other things, but amongst various Russian intelligence-related criminal organisations and individuals going on in the City of London, and that this money was being used to fund our political parties, most particularly the Conservative Party. We know that drug use is endemic amongst the upper echelons of the Conservative Party because substantial traces of cocaine have been found in toilets in Westminster frequented by these people, and we've even seen videos of coked up MPs, senior MPs, dancing around at parties and things. They are profiting hugely from the drug trade. They are also customers of the drugs trade, and yet they lobby and work very hard to sustain the laws against drugs. This hypocrisy and tension, internal conflict, seems to be very characteristic of moral discourse, right? You quite often see that the more vociferously somebody tries to signal their virtue and enforce these moral codes, right, the greater the chance that they're actually a Jekyll and Hyde, that they're actually being so intense because they're trying to cover up their own indulgences in the very things that they're condemning. There's a lovely scene in the film The Naked Civil Servant where a gang of young thugs break into some gay club or cafe, and one of them puts Quentin Crisp, or the character playing Quentin Crisp, up against a wall and threatens to beat him up, and it tells him to tell him he loves him or something. I can't remember what it was exactly that he said there, but Quentin Crisp says, well, I'll whisper it to you. And so the guy goes, go on then, whisper it. And Quentin Crisp leans over and goes, why don't you fuck off before your mates realise you're queer? And the guy explodes. But the one person he doesn't touch is Quentin. This is, intense homophobia. Who exhibit the most intense homophobia? It's not straight blokes, we don't care. It's people in denial about their own sexuality or trying to hide it. So that's not universal. It's not that everybody who's homophobic has this particular thing, but it's very common, right? So this kind of tension between the public discourse that you maintain, and what's actually going on internally, your own interests and perhaps your own desires and appetites, this kind of conflict seems to be really a significant thing in elevating things to become be part of moral discourse. So what I'm thinking is that the reason that it's so difficult to give a general account of the good, in this moral sense of the good, is that the use of the moral vocabulary of the good really grows out of the everyday concept of the good. And that in fact what's underpinning the moral concept of the good is the everyday concept of the good that we're trying to use either as a device to influence other people or as a device to maintain our or a device for our own internal psychological purposes, such as maintaining our sense of self-worth in the face of difficult circumstances and similar motifs like that. Now, if that's right, then the reason that we failed for several thousand years to give an adequate account of the good is because there is no concept of the good. There is no form of the good that is lying behind moral judgments. We're not having an intuition of one. We are using language for purposes to articulate and to try and meet our interests, various interests. And just as unpicking, just as to understand the everyday use of the good, you've really got to unpick instances, the context, the use of it. So one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century was Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein had two periods. He started out trying to develop a kind of systematic account of language and its philosophical implications. And eventually he gave up on that. He decided that this was a bad project, and he left philosophy altogether, went away, and he stopped teaching and writing for some period. And when he came back a changed man, and his later Wittgenstein was completely different. He seemed to have abandoned the idea of developing some kind of grand scheme of understanding of language and how it operates, and instead he focused very much on the particular. And I've spoken about this on other occasions, not in this video. Oh yeah, so in my previous video I talked about the purpose of philosophy, that I thought that philosophy is what you do when you don't know how to proceed. So understanding perhaps what later Wittgenstein is doing, because some people think he's abandoned philosophy. He's not doing philosophy because he isn't trying to build some universal toolkit for dealing with language anymore. But I think he's still doing philosophy. What he's now doing is saying, well, you can't, the project of developing a universal toolkit is not going to work. It's a badly formed project because there's just too much variation in how language operates in different circumstances. But what we can do is we can practice taking apart the way that language is working in a particular situation. We can practice doing that. We can expose ourselves to lots of different situations, and we can develop the kind of toolkit that a philosopher needs, right? Which is not the kind of toolkit a normal engineer needs, where they need a screwdriver to take that kind of screw out. They need a wire stripper to pull out, to strip wires in these contexts. They need a soldering iron to... No, a philosopher doesn't know what tools he's going to need. He might have to develop new ones. What he has to do is to develop the ability to deal with a wide range of situations and circumstances, and that's what Wittgenstein is kind of training us to do by taking us through unpicking the way language operates in all these different situations. Now, I think that in a way perhaps Wittgenstein goes too far, right? Because there has to be some kind of general principle in operation. There has to be some kind of rule about how language works, or we couldn't decipher what other people are doing, what their speech acts are intended to convey. You know, these rules might be very flexible. They might operate differently in different cultures and different places, but there has to be some kind of structure, some kind of rule governing speech acts, or they wouldn't be comprehensible. Right? So I think that the key to understanding morality is not to look for the overarching concept of the good, as though there is something more there than our everyday concept of the good as being a very simple relationship that works out in very different ways. Wittgenstein's sort of thing of the particulars, right? It works out differently in different cases. You can't give a general rule of it. It would have to be a vast compendium of sort of almost the whole totality of human knowledge to be able to give an account of how judgments about the good are going to operate in every single situation. And yet there's this common feature of being fit for purpose. And I think that's the key to understanding what's going on in moral discourse, that we understand that moral discourse, although it seems to be elevated into something different, is actually ultimately just grounded in this simple relation of being fit for purpose. The right thing to use in that context. That people are trying to make it more, but that's what's actually at the heart of it. And that it's understanding that lets you unpick completing moral demands, lets you see where the conflicts arise. And that's not going to solve everything, because some of the conflicts are real. Right? I mean, they're innate, they're inherent. Right? Sometimes they can. I mean, you know, I've given a thing about stealing, right? It is straightforward. You can recognise that you sometimes have an interest in an immediate context in stealing, that you would benefit from putting something in your pocket, right? And yet you can recognise that you actually have an interest not just in discouraging other people from behaving in that way, but not behaving in that way yourself. But sometimes it's more difficult, because there are competing interests in the world, and within ourselves, within our own appetites and desires and, you know, intentions, there can be conflicts. But by being able to unpick the underlying everyday concept of the good at work that's being elevated and transformed in a particular situation, we may be better able to truly understand what's going on and make viable decisions about how we balance out the various interests. In a Freudian approach to psychoanalysis, one of the most important things that you may have to do is recognize that your superego is malformed, that its judgments are not good. They're not always good. Sometimes the only way that the ego can achieve a kind of functioning relationship between the superego and the id is to actually turn on the superego and say, no, wait a minute, you're trying to tell me that's wrong. That's part of life. I need that. It's not always, it can be the other way around. It can be that it's the id that in Freudian. I'm not a Freudian, so this is just kind of an analogy. So does this lead to a kind of moral relativism then? As a philosopher, although I have studied a bit of sociology and anthropology, I do have a degree in sociology. I can't review how this plays out in every culture and every society. And it does play out differently. Because the interests at work change as the mode of production changes in a society. The dominant interests in a agricultural society are not necessarily the same as one in an industrial urban setting. So there is a kind of relativism. Maybe the solution is somewhat Wittgensteinian, right? Maybe the solution I'm suggesting here is not developing some grand account of the good, right? And it's not about an intuition of the good particularly. The intuition comes from sort of the values that you've ascribed, the resolution that you've built up over your life of the discourse that you've accepted, and which parts of it you've decided to promote and which things you've decided to suppress. And that can change. There's nothing absolute about that. That's a process that has states and it's often dynamic and changes. But it can help you to deal with this kind of moral relativism, and find a way through it. Because one of the things it definitely says is that you don't actually have to do what moral relativists are asking. In a sense, moral relativists are asking that you completely abandon moral judgments. And I'm saying, no, you can still make judgments about the good. You're going to ground them in a different way. You're going to be looking at them in a different way, unpicking them, trying to see the interests and the conflicts at play, and then make a decision about what you want to pursue out of that. You know, and this is going to be a kind of relative thing, relative to your understanding of the context and your desires and what you want to achieve out of life. But in a sense, you don't have to respect other people's moral systems. You can make judgments about other people's moral systems on this basis, because you can unpick them in the same way that you can unpick the judgments in your own culture, and you might, having unpicked them, you might say, well, that is not a very good way of resolving all the conflicts of interests that were occurring in that society. But above all, it doesn't actually require you to do that. It doesn't require you either to accept and respect the moral values of another society, or in fact to reject them, or to sit in judgment on them at all. Because the time that you should really be engaging with moral philosophy is where this kind of complex set of interactions and competing considerations and tensions that is elevating and making judgments about the good difficult is actually taking place. And something like that was taking place in ancient Rome, something like that was taking place in ancient Greece, something like that was taking place in, ancient Egypt, right? Other places, other times. During the Napoleonic Wars, there were complex moral issues at play. When the in the English Civil War, all sorts of things going on. But unless they're actually relevant and playing themselves out in the moral decisions that you're faced with, the way that they chose to resolve the conflicts and the tensions is irrelevant, unless it can actually help you understand how to make yours, This is different. And what I'm trying to get at is this is different from moral relativism. It is a form of moral relativism. But it's a form of moral relativism that doesn't deny you the right to make moral judgments. This is the problem with moral relativism. The way it's being developed in some circles, it becomes, in Thomas Nagel's language, the view from nowhere. Yet we live somewhere. We still have to make decisions. This is a kind of moral relativism that lets you make judgments. It doesn't tell you exactly how to make those judgments, because in a Wittgensteinian way, that's going to depend on the particular circumstances you're in. You can practice making those kinds of judgments by practicing moral philosophy, by considering scenarios in the way that Socrates does, and examining them and trying to see what the consequences of different decisions might be in different ways. You can become better and worse at making moral judgments. But this doesn't rob you of the right to do it, which the relativism that comes from the view from nowhere does. And that, I think, is where I shall end. I hope this might have been of some use to somebody. I was surprised with my first video. It actually got 10 likes. People don't normally bother with some of the videos I've made in the past, but well, if you made it this far, thanks for your time, and I hope it was worth it for you.